The origins of the book of Revelation are shrouded in mystery, leaving readers to speculate about its author and the circumstances under which it was written. According to the first chapter, the book was composed by a man named John, who received visions while on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. However, this scant information left ancient readers unsatisfied, and legends began to emerge to satisfy their curiosity about John and his journey to the island. Early accounts of the book suggest that its author may have been John the Apostle, one of Jesus' 12 disciples. According to these accounts, John was on the island of Patmos in approximately 95 to 96 AD, during the reign of Emperor Domitian. However, this raises questions, as John would have been quite elderly at the time. In later traditions, some embellished the story further, claiming that John had been banished to the island by the emperor himself after surviving an attempted execution by boiling in oil. Others even suggested that John had toiled in the island's non-existent mines. There are no mines on Patmos. So, let's begin by discussing the identity of the author of Revelation. In the opening chapter, the author identifies himself simply as John, your brother, without providing further details about his background. Most modern historians agree that the author's name was indeed John, setting the book apart from other apocalyptic literature which often circulates under pseudonyms. For example, apocalypses attributed to Old Testament figures, such as Enoch or Moses, were quite common. Even the authorship of the biblical book of Daniel is subject to debate. However, in the case of Revelation, it's generally assumed that the author used his given name. The Greek form of his name is Ioannis, or Yuchanan in Hebrew, and most scholars believe that the author was a Jewish Christian. Despite this agreement, there remains much debate about which specific John the author might have been. The ancient Christian tradition quickly embraced the idea that the author of Revelation was John, the son of Zebedee, who was one of Jesus' 12 disciples. According to this tradition, John was a fisherman who followed Jesus throughout his ministry and was later appointed as an apostle. While many today still subscribe to this view, there were some in the early church who disagreed. They argued that John was a common name in the region at the time and shouldn't automatically be assumed to refer to the apostle. It's possible, they argued, that the author of Revelation was another leader of the church at the time. Today, many historians also reject the idea that the apostle John wrote Revelation. One key argument is that in the book itself, the author never claims to be an apostle. Instead, he identifies himself as a servant of Christ and a brother of the Christians to whom he is writing. Additionally, he never claims to have witnessed Jesus' ministry on earth, only recording a vision in which Jesus appeared to him. Based on this evidence, there's little reason to assume that the author was the Apostle John. Based on the available evidence, it's likely that the author of Revelation was a Jewish Christian named John who lived and worked in the Roman province of Asia during the final decades of the 1st century. While it's impossible to know for certain, studying the author's language can provide insight into his character. When we examine the opening lines of the book, John's use of language becomes particularly revealing. By addressing his readers with the standard form of an ancient letter, John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace, John establishes familiarity and creates an immediate connection with his readers. Given that the book was likely read aloud to Christian communities, this language would have been particularly striking as it initially sounded very familiar to listeners. Early Christian letters typically followed a standard formula for introductions, beginning with the name of the sender, the intended recipient, and a greeting of grace and peace. Thus far, the opening lines of Revelation would have been familiar to John's readers. However, what comes next sets the tone for the rest of the book. In keeping with the tradition of early Christian letters, John sends greetings in the name of God. Most modern translations provide something along the lines of, grace to you and peace from the one who is, and who was, and who is to come, the Almighty. Yet, what is often lost in translation is just how unusual John's writing style was, compared to other New Testament authors. John's use of Greek was highly idiosyncratic and stands out from the rest of the Bible's writing conventions. John's opening greeting offers a glimpse into his unique writing style and unconventional character. By providing a literal translation of the greeting, we can appreciate just how unusual John's use of language was for the time. Instead of saying, "Greetings from him," John's literal text reads, "Grace to you and peace from he the is, and from he the was, and from he the coming one." This phrasing may sound awkward or even nonsensical to modern English speakers, but it would have been even more striking in its original Greek. John's audacious use of grammar and syntax breaks with conventional norms. When looking at John's audacious use of grammar and syntax, one must ask what lies behind this unusual expression. It could be that he was simply translating his native Hebrew into Greek as a second language, resulting in stilted or awkward phrasing. Yet other scholars propose an alternate explanation. They observe that there are multiple places where John's use of Greek is grammatically correct and fluid. This implies that John was intentionally using incorrect grammar to emphasize his point, in much the same way slang is used to bridge cultures and communicate outside of structured language conventions. In this case, John may have been conveying a message which stands in opposition to mainstream Greek and Roman society. Through his untraditional form of speech, he creates a radical contrast between his audience's expectations and the countercultural demands of Jesus' message, provoking thought and critique on contemporary institutions from a unique theological perspective. John's nonconformist language reflects a message that was also subversive and, ultimately, dangerous. This could explain why legend says he was sent to the island of Patmos for his beliefs. Historically, John was punished by the Roman authorities in Asia, likely in cities like Ephesus or Pergamum. Through John's own words, we learn that he was sent away because of the Word of God and his witness to Jesus. Clearly, his religious convictions were at odds with those in power. Though drastic measures like boiling him in oil are unlikely, it is certain that John paid quite a price for expressing his faith. The Romans viewed John's messages differently and felt something unsettling in them. As we read further in Revelation, it is clear why they felt this way. John was an ardent critic of existing social and economic practices, advocating for significant changes that threatened their power. Christians like John confessed a belief in Jesus as their Lord, a part of their messianic tradition which recognized him as God's rightful king. To alleviate these fears, the Romans labeled John's pleas as superstition, a category for religious beliefs that were seen as suspect. This label carried a certain punishment under Roman law, banishment to an island. Thus, it came to be that John found himself on Patmos, the place where he wrote Revelation. Now let us return to the setting of Patmos, though we must approach its many layers of legend with caution. Some imagine John laboring in mines or lying about in chains. Others believe it was a penal colony for hapless prisoners of the empire. There is, however, no evidence to suggest this. According to Roman law, those sent away were allowed to associate with people, even make a living on the island. They simply weren't permitted to leave. In John's time, Patmos was quite ordinary, situated along trade routes crossing the Aegean Sea and home to a harbor where travelers could stop for refuge or buy supplies from local merchants. A fort on the hilltop overlooked this harbor and provided shelter from would-be pirates. Archaeologists have since uncovered inscriptions demonstrating that Patmos had its own athletic organization, annual festivals honoring gods like Hernias and Artemis, and rituals involving sacrifices for religious rites within its community. Though most aspects of life here were routine, John's Apocalypse was an extraordinary book from these ordinary shores. As we examine this further, one has to wonder why anyone would have listened to John, a man who spoke with peculiar patterns and had a troubled past. Yet, he never asserts himself as an apostle, and his authority stems from his role as a prophet. He wrote a message for Christians of the 7 cities of Rome and Asia, but more importantly, he tapped into the wider tradition of Hebrew prophecy that permeated their scriptures. Prophets played a significant role in late 1st century Christian communities, and John bridged ancient faith traditions with prophetic insight that ultimately made an impact on those who heard him speak. John locates himself within this tradition when he recounts his own spiritual experience in the 1st chapter of his book. He says that he was in the Spirit when a voice spoke to him and, upon turning, saw Jesus, whom he also calls Christ, in a majestic form. This figure was identified as the Lord who reigned and was referred to by Jesus and Christ as part of his name. Around Jesus were 7 golden lampstands symbolizing the 7 churches to which John's readers belong. When John saw this awe-inspiring vision of Christ present among his churches, he was overwhelmed and fell to the ground. Modern interpreters struggle with understanding exactly what John is describing. Many suggest it follows a typical literary form used in apocalyptic writings, while others agree that John is writing something expected but question if there is any genuine spiritual experience behind it. How one reads it depends on whether they believe such experiences truly occur or not. In antiquity, people acknowledged the reality of spiritual experiences, but also recognized the possibility of deception by false prophets who claimed divine inspiration. The Hebrew Bible warned against false prophets and the need for discernment, while pagan cultures had their own prophetic traditions, such as the oracles of Delphi associated with the god Apollo. In this context, the Christian communities to whom John addressed his message had to navigate the challenge of discerning true from false prophets. The issue of distinguishing true from false prophets was not unique to the book of Revelation, but common to the early Christian communities. The Apostle Paul addressed this issue in his first letter to the Corinthians, where he described a scenario in which multiple individuals claimed to receive messages from God during the church gathering. While Paul acknowledged the validity of prophetic gifts, he emphasized that the messages should be evaluated and tested by the audience, not taken at face value. Similarly, the book of Revelation acknowledges the existence of prophets who were valued and respected by John, but also identifies false prophets who distorted the teachings of Jesus and led people astray. One example of this is the woman in Thyatira who claimed to be a prophet, but promoted the eating of food sacrificed to idols, which was contrary to Christian beliefs. In the early Christian communities, both women and men were believed to have the ability to prophesy. This is evident in various accounts in the New Testament, where both male and female prophets are mentioned. Therefore, gender was not the primary factor in determining the legitimacy of a prophet's message. Rather, the content and spirit of the message were the crucial criteria. Early Christians recognized that spiritual experiences alone were not enough to validate a message, as many people claimed to have such experiences. Thus, the credibility of the message was based on its coherence with the core tenets of the Christian faith, such as the character and will of God and what insights the message offered. When John wrote the book of Revelation, he knew that his readers would have to discern the value of his message and decide whether it was worth hearing and following. The opening lines of the book, which describe it as an apocalypse from Jesus Christ, were intended to capture their attention and invite their curiosity. Because the term, apocalypse, might not have been familiar to all readers, John emphasized that the events he described in the book were not distant or abstract, but imminent and urgent. They were the things that must soon take place, according to the message from Jesus Christ that God had given him. This sense of urgency added to the compelling nature of the disclosure, and urged the readers to pay attention and take action. John's declaration that his apocalypse would show the readers what must soon take place has been interpreted by many as an indication of when the world will end. However, it is not until we read on through the first 3 chapters that we gain an understanding of the true meaning of this statement. The focus of these chapters is not so much on the end of the world, but on life in this world, where different kinds of people are struggling with challenging situations. Among them are those who are being harassed and persecuted, those who have become complacent and indifferent, and those whose faith has been corrupted by religious compromise. These chapters provide a clear message to each group: for those facing harassment, persevere; for those who have become complacent and indifferent, recommit themselves to their faith; and for those caught in between, strive for a renewed sense of integrity in an often complex environment. As we explore the struggles of the readers of John's Apocalypse in ancient times, it is likely that we will discover reasons why his message was deeply compelling to them. If we can find any similarities between their situations and ours, then we may also be able to appreciate how John's message continues to challenge and provoke us today. Stay tuned.